Good evening, and for those of you on the West Coast, good afternoon. My name is Christian Hudak, and I am the Executive Director of the Dunhuang Foundation, which is a Houston, Texas-based organization dedicated to the conservation and preservation of the Dunhuang Caves in China. Fittingly, given the historical moment that we're living through, much of our work is in the field of digital preservation, and we're doing our best to adapt to the current circumstances for however long that they're with us. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second of our 5-part lecture series. As you're no doubt aware, travel is off the table for many of us due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Under normal circumstances, I'd likely be welcoming many of you in person to one of the Foundation's trips at this time of year. We might not be able to visit China at this time, but we can certainly use this opportunity to examine key themes that we regularly explore when our boots are on the ground. Thanks for having an open mind and for giving of your time. It's one of the only things that we really have right now is time, but regardless, I know that people have all sorts of constraints, so it means a lot to have all of you here. Our speaker this evening is Ellen Larson, who is completing her dissertation in the field of art history at the University of Pittsburgh. She's an accomplished scholar who specializes in contemporary video art from China. In addition to her scholarly commitments, Ellen currently works as Telfay's research assistant, and through this avenue helped contribute to the artist's exhibition at the Centre Pompidou in Paris, France. We're committed to supporting the work of young scholars and are thrilled to have her with us tonight. Ellen's presentation will be broken into 2 sections. It will start by introducing the Cultural Revolution as an important contextual reference before delving into developments that occurred throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The second section will begin around the turn of the millennium, characterized by themes of internationalism, infrastructure, and remodernization, and continue through to movements impacting China's art scene today. If during the lecture you have any questions for Ellen, please go ahead and send them via the text box that's at the bottom of your screen. We'll have a brief Q&A period after each section concludes, and also a short intermission at the halfway point of about 5 minutes. For those of you that were with us on our first lecture, it's the same format, and that'll be the format moving forward. Without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and turn the evening over to our speaker, Miss Ellen Larson.
Hello, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'm thrilled to be with you all this evening to discuss the ongoing evolution of contemporary art from China, based in both Beijing and beyond. Before I begin, I would like to extend my deep gratitude to both Christian and Julia for the invitation to speak this evening, as well as the entire Dunhuang Foundation for their generous invitation. I would also like to underscore thanks to the generosity in both Julie and Christian's comments and feedback as I put together this presentation. So as we begin our discussion this evening, I think that it's important for us to first examine a more of an adequate introduction to contemporary Chinese art, which began in the late 1970s by framing our discussion with a brief overview of socio-political conditions of the preceding 2 decades. Specifically the Cultural Revolution era. So this is important for us to discuss both social and the artistic legacy of the Cultural Revolution, as many of the earliest contemporary Chinese artists, they came of age during the Cultural Revolution and even participated in varying capacities in both deliberate ways and more as the products of circumstance, I suppose we could say. So the Cultural Revolution was a politicized period that was initiated by then leader Mao Zedong, which lasted between 1966 and 1976. And so socially and politically, this was a mass movement that was largely carried out by young people, aimed at purifying the party and society of what were thought of as liberal bourgeois elements. And so in this effort, there was this call to destroy what was called the four olds, meaning old ideas, old customs, old culture, and old habits. And so you can see on the right image some individuals that are gathered and they are burning books, right? They are destroying old culture and old ideas. So in addition, the Cultural Revolution sought to replace the four olds with an entirely new culture, and of course promote the ideas of Chairman Mao during this period and the Communist Party, inspiring political enthusiasm among people, especially young people. And so during this period, young people from urban centers who belonged to what were thought of as bad class backgrounds, they were sent to the countryside to be re-educated. Many artists who later rose to prominence in decades following the end of the Cultural Revolution, they actually took part in these re-education programs. Some of the artists that I will introduce later on in the presentation. So artistically, images created during the Cultural Revolution, they focus on representations of workers, peasants, and soldiers, incorporating this pictorial style in Chinese known as Hong Guang Liang, or red, bright, shining, which really was the embodiment of Cultural Revolution values. You know, red, of course, indicates communism, political ideology, and then bright and shining are both visceral representations, youthful vigor, health, vitality, which of course goes back to the ideological goals of the Cultural Revolution. So artistic modes were familiar to masses. As you can see in both of these images, Cultural Revolution styles, they incorporated socialist realism, which was influenced by the Soviet Union. And so it's also important to recognize that during this period, artistic freedom was virtually non-existent. And I think that that's illustrated really well in the image on the right, in which art production, you know, it was this effort among the people. And so the image, it's a really great embodiment of, you know, ideology being put to work, the people collaborating on a new culture, again, a cultural revolution. Of course, art during the Cultural Revolution had a single patron, right? Chairman Mao, of course. And so Chairman Mao, in his leadership, instructed that art making was intended for the masses, while at the same time was aimed at supporting his own thoughts, his own deeds, and of course, his own political directives. So I like to summarize art during the Cultural Revolution as the pictorial embodiment of Mao, the party, and the people. And so, of course, all works created during this period, they were aimed at visual literacy. And so what I mean when I say that is what I like to call Art 101 kind of stuff. So basic pictorial design, if you will, that allows the image to be read very clearly, very deliberately. So case in point, Mao, he is in the center, right? He is the most important individual in the image. So we have to place him in the center. Emphasis not only in terms of his placement, but also the way in which individuals look to him, right? So the individual on his right is looking at him, and then other individuals, they are looking off into the future, which we can imagine is the glorious future under communism, under Mao's communism, you know, thanks to the efforts of the Cultural Revolution. And so in addition to him being placed in the center, he, in some ways, he also glows, he radiates, right? So he embodies ideology. And so this comes back to this Hong Guang Liang, this red, bright, shining pictorial tool that we see throughout lots of Cultural Revolution era works. And so it's important because no matter who you are, no matter what your level of education is, you are able to read and ascertain meaning from the images. And so in addition to incorporating socialist realism, there is a great deal of idealism that's happening at the same time. These images of individuals, they often have grand theatrical gestures and sometimes incorporate traditional styles as long as they promote Cultural Revolution ideals and values. So it's important that they are clear, that they are very readable, easy to understand, and of course there is no confusion in terms of what the ideological message is. So I bring in an image on the right from a model opera that was developed during the Cultural Revolution period, the Red Detachment of Women. And I bring it in because I think that it does a really good job of creating this, this consistency in terms of both style and form. So in all of these images, all art forms rather, there's this emphasis on idealized figures, theatricality in the poses, and strength and heroism that comes throughout. And so this is not by accident, rather it's really by design. During this period, Jiang Qing, who was also known as Madame Mao, she was Mao's fourth wife, the wife up until his death. And so during this period, she was the deputy director of the Central Cultural Revolution Group. And so she dominated Chinese arts during this period and was particularly interested in reforming Beijing opera. And so her interest in opera stemmed from her early career as an actress, as a performer. They were really responsible for developing this high Cultural Revolution style, not only in terms of theater performance, but also in terms of painting, creating this kind of high painting style. So the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976. It was marked by the death of Mao on September 9th. 1976. And so this period also marked by the death of Premier Zhou Enlai. The image on the screen is actually from his memorial, which took place earlier that year in April of 1976. And so Zhou Enlai, he was seen as perhaps more of a sympathetic figure to many in China. And so his death, in addition to Chairman Mao's death, really shook the nation. And so there was this period of mourning in addition to reflection, which took place, reflecting over the previous, what was identified in many ways as the decade of chaos. Because of course, as I just mentioned, this was a period that led to great destruction of historical and cultural artifacts. Many who were deemed to be intellectuals or rightists, or those coming from bad class backgrounds or Black families, Black meaning bad, they were detained, they were mistreated, and they were ultimately identified as bourgeois. And so they also, they faced quite a bit of violence against, or at the hands of the Red Guard rather. This was also a period in which schools were closed. And so this ultimately created this kind of lost generation of individuals who suffered greatly due to lack of education, and then, thus subsequently lack of job opportunities after the Cultural Revolution ended. So the reason why I sort of belabor over this social context is because this kind of social criticism that emerged during this period, it really manifested doubts over the effectiveness of the Cultural Revolution. And these doubts, they also they led to various developments in earliest forms of contemporary Chinese art. So during this period, in this post-Cultural Revolution period, we see the emergence of New Realism, that's scar art and rustic realism painting, also academicism, and the emergence of Beijing-based avant-garde groups, such as the No Name Painting Society and the Stars. So beginning with scar art. So scar art is a very classic post-Cultural Revolution style. It incorporates socialist realism that was used during the Cultural Revolution in terms of form, but drastically departs in terms of subject matter, as these are representations of real people and real feelings, right? Unlike the kind of idealized theatrical who are featured in Cultural Revolution era paintings, here individuals, they embody feelings of forlornment, trauma, isolation. And so here we see also critique of former party leaders, as well as the re-education movement itself, right? There's this emphasis on youth or innocence that has been destroyed because of the Cultural Revolution. And so there's also this kind of deep melancholy that happens at the same time. And so, as is indicated, artists of this period who worked in the scar art form, they wanted to show purity, loyalty, and love inherent in the tragedy of their generation. They wanted to represent the beautiful things that were coldly destroyed by the naked, brutal reality of the Cultural Revolution. So this is quite critical of what happened just a few years before. And so I think it's important for us to also examine the differences, right? While there are formal similarities in terms of, adopting oil painting as a style and oil painting that is rather realistic, if we focus on the faces, on the emotions, right? The image on the right is much more melancholy. These individuals, they're seemingly overcome with reflection, and they're kind of staring out into space, right? And each individual, they're looking in a different direction, seemingly not sure of what to do next. Whereas during the Cultural Revolution, of course, everybody, their gaze, it was pointed in the same direction, right? And so it's a remarkable difference in terms of what artists were depicting as a way to comment and critique what had just taken place during the Cultural Revolution. Another artistic style that developed during this period is known as rustic realism. And so rustic realism depicts ordinary people, peasants, shepherds, along with Chinese minority groups. And so these individuals, they are depicted in a very unidealized form. And again, there's a similar kind of melancholy that is evocative in these images. And so there's this kind of humanism, right? This emphasis on the human character or the human psychology or emotions of these individuals by through the depiction of ordinary people doing ordinary things. And so it's also important to note that many of scar artists and rustic realism artists, they were the artists of the former Red Guard generation. And so many of these individuals who were sent off to the countryside to learn from the peasants during the Cultural Revolution, they then painted individuals who were living in very rural parts of the country. And so I think in terms of style and content, for me at least, the American artist Andrew Wyeth's painting, Christina's World, really comes to mind. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with this, but Andrew Wyeth is a very well-known American painter, and so the reason why I bring it up, in addition to making an interesting comparison in terms of two girls who are sitting in this prairie, is that during the Cultural Revolution there was virtually no access to the outside world. Individuals could not, they could not read books that were coming from the United States or from Europe. There was no access to art that was happening during this period. But then after the Cultural Revolution, it was sort of this period of newfound cultural engagement, where artists, they embraced not only artistic styles happening elsewhere, but they also embraced Western theory, philosophy, and cultural criticism. So artists are definitely engaging in this kind of international exchange for the first time, something that could happen during the Cultural Revolution period. In addition, there is the emergence of this new kind of academicism that's taking place during this period, as is evident in the Luo Zhongli painting, highly technically skilled painting using naturalistic colors and photorealist techniques. And so here, this image of father, sort of this generalized father-like figure, right, who's actually a peasant, we see, his every wrinkle in perfect detail, his down to his weather-beaten face, the sweat that is coming off of his brow, right? His pair of hardworking hands, the old bowl, right? That's seemingly been used for generations. And so just as if we were photographers, we catch him just in a moment, right? It's a snapshot, just in a moment as he's about to take a drink of water. And so again, I bring back our Cultural Revolution image just to note the stark difference, right? And so whereas Cultural Revolution imagery is attempting to establish ideology, right? It's this desire to educate. It's a tool, right? It's a tool. It's a propaganda tool, right? Whereas on the left, the image of father is an investigation of everyday life and everyday existence. And so, whereas the image of the workers in the Cultural Revolution era painting, again, I'm going back to the gaze, as they are looking outwards, right, looking forward into this, this future under communism. I love to describe it in that way. The gaze with the peasant is our gaze, right? And so there's much more of an interest in sort of inward documentation of his everyday life, his everyday existence, but also him as a person, as an identity, rather than something that's idealized. And so, as I mentioned, when I began, Beijing was really at the center in many ways of contemporary Chinese art activities, with the earliest avant-garde groups being organized in Beijing. And so the image on the screen is actually an announcement for an exhibition of a group called the Stars. the Stars exhibition. And so the Stars exhibition, they were a group of untrained artists. Again, remember, we're just finished with the Cultural Revolution, so none of these individuals went to art school. And many were actually members of the Red Guard. And so after the Cultural Revolution ended, they started to make work. And these individuals, they got together and they decided that they were going to have an unofficial exhibition hung on the fences of, at that time, the National Art Gallery. It has now been rebranded as the National Art Museum of China, NAMOC. But it's important for us to note how significant this action was, right? So these individuals, they had over 100 works, around 150 works, and they just went and they just put them up without any kind of official permission. They didn't go through any kind of proper channel. They just did it. And so, as you can imagine, a few hours after the exhibition was first put up, the police came and they ordered everybody to disband, everybody to go away, and they confiscated all the works. And so after that happened, the leaders of the Stars, they organized a protest, right? They believed that it was in their constitutional right to be able to organize this kind of exhibition, non-official, even though it was non-official. And it was also in their constitutional right to be able to protest what they thought was the unfair closure of their exhibition. And so ultimately, the protest did lead to an officially recognized exhibition that took place a year later in 1980. And here are members of the Stars group outside of the exhibition space, outside of the then National Art Gallery. So another important avant-garde group was the No Name Painting Society. And so they were really interested in painting art for art's sake, incorporating Western modernism, as well as traditional literati techniques. And so here, this image was painted based on the memorial for Zhou Enlai back in April 1976. And so it's painted by an artist, Zheng Ziyan. And so here, Zheng Ziyan, she is seen in the center, flanked by two additional artists, part of the no-name painters on either side. And so the no-name painters, they embraced en plein air painting, right? They went out into nature, they were inspired by nature. So in many ways, they adopted these kind of traditional literati attitudes to painting, rather than being interested in painting something for what it was right in front of them with this highly realistic representation. They were more interested in painting just because they wanted to paint, or paint the energy, paint the spirit of what they were painting. And so this is an announcement for a no-name painting society, which it actually took place before the Stars exhibition. And so often, when we talk about the history of the earliest contemporary Chinese art activities, especially avant-garde activities, the Stars painters, they are often credited as the first group, but in fact, members of the No Name Painting Society, they were having exhibitions before, and even actually they painted during the Cultural Revolution too. So beginning in 1985, there was this kind of this explosion of discussion happening. Goming Lu refers to this as the Great Cultural Discussion, as this was, in this period, it was the first few years which followed a set of sweeping economic and cultural reforms that ushered in what then Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, what he called socialism with Chinese characteristics, meaning the introduction of a semi-market economy. And so this initiated, in addition to these economic reforms, these cultural reforms, they initiated this kind of cultural fever in media, in art, in academics, and that lasted between 1985 and 1989. And so the 85 New Wave movement, it was coined by the esteemed critic, curator, my PhD advisor, Goming Lu. And so here he has generously shared some of the data that he collected of the 85 New Wave with me. And so the 85 New Wave, it was the result, again, of this influx of theory and culture that was imported from the West. And you see this dramatic rise in artistic groups that emerged nationwide. Following the end of the Cultural Revolution, of course, there were no avant-garde groups in China, but then it's really remarkable to see the dramatic rise happening in 85. And so this was something that was not limited necessarily to urban centers, but there were this influx of artistic activities that happened throughout the country. In addition to a re-emergence rather, of periodicals, newspapers about art activities. Of course, during the Cultural Revolution, people were not working on publications, were not editing arts newspapers. So again, for the first time, there's this great amount of energy happening within the development of contemporary art, thanks to this reopening that was happening during the period. And so for the first time, performance took place. On the right is documentation from a performance, and on the left, an exhibition of both painting and sculpture in these forms that were sort of a hybrid that adopted Western styles in addition to Chinese styles. So this period also saw the emergence of what is known as rationalist painting. And so this is defined as sort of this cool, serious, solemn approach to painting with restraint in both technique, in addition to choice of subject. Meant to enlighten the masses, alleviate spiritual consciousness, and was really opposed to any kind of direct self-expression, rather something that was more meditative, spiritual. And another example. And so I think it's interesting to, again, bring in the comparison between the Cultural Revolution era Mao on the left and the 85 New Wave rationalist painting on the right, almost as if we are analyzing Mao, or the approach to Mao is more solemn, or it's more rational in a way, rather than something that is red and emotional and visceral and ideological. Another kind of art that emerged during this period is idea art. And so Xu Bing, internationally acclaimed artist, he was very invested in idea art during this period, which is critical of both romanticism and utopianism that was prominent during the Cultural Revolution, much more interested in themes and metaphors and symbolism. And so this was sort of a very direct way in which Mao's representational art was replaced by this highly conceptual kind of art that emphasized practice, right, as a means of achieving enlightenment, sort of analogous to Taoism, metaphysical enlightenment, Buddhism, things like that. And so Xu Bing himself, he was born in 1955, so he was the child of Beijing University librarians, and so he grew up during the Cultural Revolution and was re-educated in the countryside due to his quote-unquote bad class background. And so the work that you see on the screen, it displays this set of books that were first displayed and hung in Beijing in 1988. And so the books themselves, they contain over 4,000 invented characters that cannot be decoded, right? They're pseudo characters. And so the work, it really raises a lot of fundamental questions about Chinese identity and its relationship to the written word. So the artist believes very strongly that writing is the essence of culture. And so his subversion of writing and language and the ability to read, it really speaks to the need to communicate along with the dangers of distorting or eliminating intended meaning. So there's another image of the work. And so another artist also interested in text is an artist named Wu Shanzhuan. And so his practice during this period was much more interested in mass culture. He collected pieces of Mao's revolutionary linguistic culture, words, phrases, terms used during the Cultural Revolution, and sort of infused them together with growing consumer culture that was developing during the 1980s initially, and then certainly during the 1990s. And so he juxtaposed, these kind of contradictory fragments of language together, creating this kind of information overload. So like this pre-internet, feeling of being overwhelmed by so much information. And so thus creating this kind of sensory confusion and making it almost impossible to ascertain any kind of knowledge from any of the characters. So he was also interested in creating nonsense characters himself. And so then that brings us to 1989, a pivotal year in the development of contemporary Chinese art. And so I think with that.
Hello, Ellen. I have some questions for you. Thank you for that excellent presentation. That was such a wonderful summary of the development of Chinese art, during and after the Cultural Revolution. So I had a few questions that touch on that. The first is, were concerns of artists around China similar, or did people from different cities or regions concentrate on different themes? If so, what were some of these themes?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually something that I'm quite invested in examining with my own research, thinking about how, Beijing, its identity as the political center for the country. And so artists who are working in Beijing, they're interested in, I would say they're interested they're more interested in political issues. Whereas, for example, in southern China, in the city of Hangzhou, Hangzhou is a traditional literati center, center to scholars for several hundred years. And so these artists, they are more interested in abstracted forms or media itself, and not necessarily invested in the same kind of narrative that artists based in Beijing are. And then of course there are also artists in Guangzhou who, Guangzhou itself, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, but Guangzhou in the Pearl River Delta region is the first part of China that was developed, thanks to the economic and cultural reforms of Deng Xiaoping. And so that region, it's close to Hong Kong, and so there was lots of cultural flux that was happening, confluence of various cultural influences that were coming together, and so there's this greater hybridity, and also like a greater interest in urban change in that part.
Oh, that's fascinating. So would you say that the regions, I mean, till this day have retained that? Like Beijing has retained its political focus, Hangzhou has retained its more literati bent?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think that, of course, with the advent of the internet, I feel like art activities, everything's gotten so much closer. Right. I mean, even within China and outside of China, and so people they're communicating with people all over the world. So I think that while I think that there are, of course, elements of localization or local interest. At the same time, I think that there's also this kind of international exchange that's happening all over.
Right. Okay, that's a good summary. Thank you. We have another question that's come in. Did artists in the late 80s have access to global art? If so, was it through magazines?
Yeah, so after 1978 and into the early 80s, artists, they definitely had access to books, to newspapers, to magazines. Also, there were artists coming from other parts of the world, other global artists that were coming to China for the first time. Robert Rauschenberg, the acclaimed American artist, he staged an exhibition at the National Art Gallery. And so there were lots of conversations that were happening between artists directly, and then also artists and curators too. In the 1990s, American curators, they were traveling to China and they were bringing videos, and of course this was happening in the 80s too, but lots and lots of exchange happening.
Right. So everything really opened up in the 90s. I mean, if the door started to crack open in the 80s and then it kind of exploded in the 90s.
Sure.
Okay. Well, we have another question. Were artists knowledgeable about historical Chinese art? What were artists' attitudes towards China's past?
Absolutely. Many, and I think that also relates to this literati tradition, mm-hmm. that I think that as an artist in China, these individuals, they were keenly aware of traditional arts, and we're definitely in some ways drawing from styles. I mean, we also see it directly with the No Name group. Yep. They're interested in that kind of art for art's sake, which I would say is a similar attitude to literati painting throughout China's dynastic history.
Right, less of the Cultural Revolution, art has to have a purpose, and the purpose is to advance the party.
Totally.
Okay, so we have one more question that came in. Were art collection and market forces a factor during this period?
The 80s, not so much, but by the early 90s, absolutely. Okay. The Chinese market exploded, and that had a lot to do with, there was an exhibition that happened, it was staged in 1989 at the Pompidou, Magicians de la Terre. And, yeah. And so that exhibition in addition to artists from mainland China showing at the Venice Biennale for the first time in the early 90s, those events, really allowed the Chinese art market to expand. And so that, I would say that that's a phenomenon that definitely happened in the 90s. And then, the second part of my presentation will definitely talk about that in a bit.
This is a related question in terms of relating to the second part of the presentation. Have the immediate post-cultural revolution artistic movements that you discussed, such as scar art or the 85 New Wave or stars, have they had any repercussions for contemporary art in China? So art today.
In terms of influence?
In terms of influence or people who do any callbacks. I know that there are artists from the period who are still practicing, but younger artists who explicitly reference these movements or make, very bold callbacks to them in their work.
I think in terms of what these artists were doing and what they stood for, in terms of direct, a young artist deciding that they wanted to, emulate what the stars were doing, not necessarily.
Okay.
I think it's also important to note that the significance of the stars is not necessarily in terms of the work that they were actually producing. In many ways, some of their works could be described as pretty derivative, sort of direct copies of modern sculpture being created in Europe and the United States. But I think the significance is, not only did they have the audacity to take their works and to just hang them up outside without any kind of institutional approval, but then they also, believed that it was in their right to then, protest that unfair closure and that unfair acquisition of their works that they thought was not right.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, we have one or two more questions that are coming in, but I'm going to save them because we're running short on time. So for the second Q&A, when we come back after your second part of your presentation. So at the moment, it is 7:49 on the East Coast, 6:49 Central. So we will adjourn for about 5 minutes. So if everybody could meet back here at, we'll say 7:55 for those in the East Coast, 6:55 for those Central. And I look forward to seeing everyone then. Thanks again, Ellen.
Okay, so picking up where we left off, as I mentioned, 1989 was a very important year in terms of the development of contemporary Chinese art. Primarily, 1989 was the year in which the China Avant-Garde exhibition was staged, which can really be considered as the culminating art event of the 85 New Wave movement, a retrospective exhibition of sorts that was organized chiefly by Gao Minglu. The exhibition, it opened on October 5th, 1989, and resulted from over 4 years of planning. And so according to the preparation notice, which I think does a really nice job of sort of summarizing the chief goals of the exhibition, the curators, they noted that the show was to reflect the art trends and experimental explorations of the past few years that are being debated and evaluated by the art circle, and the value and significance of modern art in the development of Chinese culture. So in terms of display, the China Avant-Garde exhibition, it featured over 300 works made between 1985 and 1989. So the exhibition itself, it encompassed 3 floors of the National Art Museum. On the third floor were experimental versions of traditional painting. On the second floor were the sort of rational painting, the religious metaphysical painting on the second floor, and then installations and performances took place on the first floor. So in total, the exhibition, it lasted only 2 weeks. And was not without controversy. So first, during the opening of the exhibition, the opening ceremony, the artist Xiao Lu, she fired 2 gunshots into her installation dialogue, the image documenting the performance action of sorts on the screen. And so following Xiao Lu's action, the police were called and the exhibition was immediately shut down. Here is Gongming Lu in the center on the image on the right, addressing the police and addressing the crowd. And so this closure, it received international attention. There was a story written about the gunshot and the closure in the New York Times, which unfortunately really overshadowed much of the other work and much of the really all of the progress that had been made during these 4 years. And so here is an image that indicates that the show had been closed. So the show was closed for 2 days following the gunshot, and then was opened up. But then shortly after it was reopened, there was a bomb threat that caused the exhibition to close down again. So in total, the exhibition was closed twice, and there was this this commemorative postcard that was made. And so the characters on the left, 2次停展, which means the exhibition was closed twice, which in some ways was sort of the unfortunate legacy of the China avant-garde exhibition. In addition, the exhibition itself, it foreshadowed the unfortunate events which took place in Beijing a few months later. Of course, a few months after the closure of the exhibition, democracy protests, they broke out in Beijing, and they culminated in the Tiananmen Square protests in the late spring. These protests sadly ended in violence, with hundreds, perhaps thousands of protesters were killed, though the exact numbers were never released. And so in China, this is known as the June 4th movement or the Tiananmen incident, whereas in the US, we often refer to as the Tiananmen massacre. So following the Tiananmen incident, the major cultural crackdowns took place on art activities throughout the country. Gongming Lu himself, the organizer of China Avant-Garde, he was placed under house arrest and was not able to organize exhibitions for an entire year, thus bringing the 85 New Wave movement to a very, very clear end. And so until 1989, exhibitions that were organized by Beijing-based groups, they received government permission. And so they took place within official spaces, of course, after the initial STARS exhibition. But later on, throughout the 1980s, the No Name Painting Society, the STARS, along, of course, the China Avant-Garde, they received official support. But during the 1990s, following these crackdowns, all public exhibitions, especially in Beijing, they were banned in the early part of the 1990s. And so thus, this kind of unofficial movement emerged, which is apartment art, 90s apartment art. So 1990s apartment art is really important because it marks these changing relationships between artists and their environments after the banning of exhibitions. And so characteristically, A lot of the apartment artworks, they are characterized by individual meditations, this idea of totality, which encompasses daily life and neighborhood surroundings, in addition to drawing from elements of the artist's personal lives, their own personal items, relationships, etc. And so again, these are these projects are meant to be observational and above all deeply, deeply personal. And so as a part of apartment art, this action called Projects on Paper emerged, that is characterized by its documentary qualities and also the embrace of normality in everyday life. And so this project that was led in 1994 was called Agree to the Date, November 26th, 1994 as a Reason. And so in many ways, this was sort of a mail art project where artists all over China, they participated in these individual actions, albeit on the same day, November 26th, 1994. So all individual but collective action. And so that brought these actions together was simply the date, right? November 26, 1994. And so the artist, Yang Zhenzhong, he, as a part of his action, his, agree to the date, November 26, 1994, as a reason, he bought a birthday cake and he went to a graveyard and he found somebody whose birthday was on November 26th. And so he placed a birthday cake in front of the grave and then documented that. So in addition, another artist, Song Dong, his water diary project, which is actually an ongoing project, it could also be characterized as this kind of apartment art activity where each morning the artist wakes up and writes a diary entry on a slab of stone using a brush and water. And so as he writes the diary entry, slowly over time, it disappears. And so again, this is an emphasis on the everyday, his personal environment, his personal feelings, and own tools and materials that are readily available. Another work by Song Dong, Culture Noodles, again, placed within the context of his everyday home environment. The work, it uses this tool that you use to make noodles, and the artist took books, cultural objects, and made them into culture noodles. Another work, Zhu Jinshi, his Xi'an paper project, where this is his own intimate home space and transforming the space into a space for exhibition, again using personal items that are readily available around the house. Another work by, this work by Lin Tianmiao, Bound and Unbound. The artist, she found everyday objects, just walking around the house, and she wrapped them in string. And so this, like many other apartment artworks, they are highly laborious, right? They involve a lot of labor, but in this kind of act of unproductive productivity, she renders the objects essentially useless, and the objects are then exhibited within the home. And so the works themselves, throughout all kinds of apartment art projects, they are not intended to be reproduced, re-exhibited, or sold. They emphasize private space. So the artist Wong Gong Lin, who is the husband of Lin Tianmiao, he created a video installation titled Sky of Brooklyn, which you can see it depicts a TV screen placed within a hole that the artist dug in his Beijing apartment space. And so what is being broadcast on the screen is actually the sky of Brooklyn. So Wong Gong Lin, Lin Tianmiao, during the early 90s, they actually spent time in New York studying and working. And so this was footage that he took while living in New York. And so the project is sort of this, in some ways, this cheeky reference to the colloquialism, digging a hole to China, but sort of placing that on its head and digging a hole to the US, digging a hole to Brooklyn. And so I'll also note that Wang Gongxin and Lin Tianmiao, during this time, they also were a really important part of the Beijing art scene, what it was during the 1990s, because during their time living in New York in the early 90s, they participated in these kind of open studios where people would come around and look at each other's work and share meals. And so they brought that back to Beijing with them, and that became a really important part of the local art scene, the local culture within Beijing. So another artistic style to emerge during this period is political pop. And so political pop is a very deliberate comment on emerging Chinese consumerism in light of Deng Xiaoping's socialism with Chinese characteristics. And so I hope that this answers one of the questions that was raised about the emergence of the art market and artistic responses to that. So by the early 1990s, this policy, this new kind of semi-market policy, it transformed much of Chinese urban spaces, along with inaugurating the country as the quote-unquote world's factory. So works of political pop themselves, especially the one that we see on the screen, it makes this juxtaposition between this work of contemporary art and socialist realist iconography and symbols within this kind of contradictory discursive system. So the work itself, it's reconstructing revolutionary history, employed via socialist realism, also woodblock forms, revolutionary woodblocks, which were another important style used during the Cultural Revolution period, placing emphasis on labor, in a contemporary context, capitalism, consumerism, all within this kind of new emerging, communist country. And so within this system, China contributed to this opening up. And so these new kinds of conditions of internationalism, infrastructure, and remodernization took place at the turn of the new millennium. And so this is really personified by a lot of important retrospective exhibitions of contemporary art that were staged in both the US and Europe, along with, as I mentioned before, Chinese participation in biennales, and of course, the Chinese art market. This also led to really important collections that were created during the 90s and into the 2000s, primarily by the Uli Sig, along with Miriam and Guy Ullins, who were the original proprietors of the Ullin Center of Contemporary Art, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. And so this also saw the emergence of the creation of art districts within the context of Beijing. 798 Art District is one of the most important cultural hubs in the city. It was a former factory complex originally constructed in 1957, and then was the home to several artist studios around the year 2000. 2000, and then galleries soon followed. And by 2007, it was decided that this area, it would continue its current format as a special art zone. And so now if you go to 798 Art District today, you will find that it's this thriving cultural hotspot with home to both domestic and international galleries, restaurants, boutiques, coffee shops, bookstores, of the like. And so coming back to the discussion of UCCA, UCCA was founded as, I just mentioned, the Ulin Center of Contemporary Art by Miriam and Guy Ulins. And then in 2017, it transitioned to new ownership. And so now it's officially known as the UCCA Center for Contemporary Art. And so I emphasize the UCCA not only within the context of 798, but also in a broader context of the Beijing art world and beyond, because it's really this critical supporter of contemporary art activities within the city and all over the country, presenting over its time, over the last several years, it's presented over 140 exhibitions, including the 85 New Wave, the birth of Chinese contemporary art in 2007, another important exhibition on off, China's Young Artists in Concept and Practice, that was organized in 2013. UCCA was also the organizer of Xu Bing's retrospective exhibition, which took place in 2018 and was the artist's largest retrospective in China to date. And then last year, UCCA organized a large-scale Picasso exhibition. So within this globalizing cultural climate, I guess we can say, the internet has played a major role in the development of recent contemporary art activities. Around the mid-2000s, blogs, they began to really revolutionize vernacular creativity and led to this accelerating influx of new users, ultimately leading to over 100 million people online. And so this new format, it allowed everyone to set up their own page and start sharing content. And so artists, they soon follow suit. And a lot of artists during this period, they had their own blogs where they were sharing their own writings in addition to work and communicating with people from all over. So really, creativity has always been a central component of the Chinese internet. And so in many ways, the artist Cao Fei is one of the leading pioneers of the internet with Chinese characteristics generation. She's one of the first Chinese artists to completely embrace the internet as an aesthetic medium. And so resultingly, the work that you see on the screen, this is called R&B City. With this work, Cao Fei, she took her creative practice into digital virtual space, where she began interacting with the online gaming platform Second Life, which is a website where you can collaborate with users from all over the world to create this virtual built environment. And so using Second Life, she created this virtual metropolis, all with her own avatar, her own digital avatar that she named China Tracy. And so the result then is this really wonderful, rich digital manifestation of urban China infused with lots of virtual aesthetics called R&B City. And so R&B City, in many ways, it engages in this kind of continuous process of making and remaking, you know, much like urban space in China today. And so it allows for this constant kind of invention and participation for those who are also engaging in the Second Life platform. And through this kind of construction and mediation of virtual spaces, the artist, she's thinking about various relationships in terms terms of social structures, in terms of power, and of course, connectivity within this increasingly consumerist and in some ways isolating society. So sort of like stories from classical Chinese utopias, RMB City, it's an escape, right, from the real world into a virtual world. And so users, they adopt their own digital avatars, and they can kind of transcend into imagined characters. Within the context of this virtual realm that's no longer in conflict with any kind of social norm or, any kind of temporality otherwise. And so here, stay with me on this. I think that there's this really interesting connection between Cao Fei's works and early works of contemporary Chinese art, right? Especially if we think about this investment in documenting one's own lived reality, right? That's what Luo Zhongli is interested in doing. He's interested in documenting, in recording the true reality of the peasant in some ways. And so in Cao Fei's case, this reality has been deeply shaped by fast-paced development and increased engagement with virtual space. And so most recently in 2019, the artist, she created, or she came out with this, her first full-length feature film, a retro sci-fi movie called Nova, which is the culmination of these kind of shifting temporalities that I was just mentioning, that loop together the real with the virtual, the analog with the digital, reality with memory, and of course, blending together the past, the present, and the future. And so the project itself, or the film itself rather, I'm sorry, it's a story of a Chinese computer scientist who launches his son into this virtual unknown where time in many ways stands still. And so it incorporates elements of China's industrial history and socialist legacy. And so in this way, the film is really teeming with utopian nostalgia. And so in some ways, right, then coming back to earlier works of contemporary Chinese art, I feel like this work also nods to the past, especially, both are examining China's early PRC history in various ways. And so there's this interesting kind of juxtaposition that's happening with both works, where they're interested in looking at the past and placing them together with the present and arguably future forms. So let's see. So the work itself, right, moving back and forth across time, Nova, in some ways, it's analogous to the way in which we've become fully immersed, even lost within virtual space. And so the work, it really asks how our relationships to one another, how they change in virtual space and what's lost in these virtual exchanges, right? Of course, within this space that we're all in right now, as I speak to you all on Zoom, what remains absent in our exchange, right? What becomes lost because we're no longer able to share physical space or physical exchange? These are a lot of the questions that Nova raises in many ways. And so then moving forward to this even younger, newer generation of artists that in many ways, they've never known China that is not connected to global information networks as sort of digital natives within the internet with Chinese characteristics, right? And so in some ways, right, again, attempting to draw back to some of the earlier movements that I covered in the presentation, in some ways, right, if we think about them as analogous to apartment artists during the 1990s, perhaps, right? And so these apartment artists, they made work and they shared with artist friends during this time when it was impossible to display works publicly, right? And so internet with Chinese characteristics generation, these artists, they have sort of learned their way around the internet during their teenage years, and they're able to produce work to connect with others despite any kind of, you know, restraints that they might face with the just the nature of the internet in China today. And so this younger generation of artists, they are really the product of profound technological transformation, especially if we think about how China just, you know, simply within the last few years in many ways has transformed into this cashless society where if you want to make any kind of commercial transaction, you know, you're not paying with cash, but you are scanning a QR code, right, on a WeChat wallet or Alipay, which are sort of analogous to Venmo or to PayPal. And so everything is done within virtual space. In addition, there's this great investment in new technologies such as AI, facial recognition software, e-commerce, home delivery services. So they're transforming not only China's physical landscapes, but also virtual landscapes. So more and more people, they're kind of leaving real spaces and interpersonal interactions, and they're entering into virtual ones. And so I think that, you know, the application WeChat itself, you know, if you go to, I'm sure if any of you have been to China, you absolutely have WeChat. Or if you haven't been to China, you definitely need to get WeChat. That's my one recommendation for anybody planning a trip to China in the future. Because within within WeChat's virtual application, users, they can chat with friends, video conference, purchase movie tickets, buy plane tickets, train tickets, use WeChat wallet that I just mentioned, you know, the kind of the payment platform. You can pay for utilities, you can buy insurance, you can book a hotel room, you can find a house or apartment, you can order takeout, you can order groceries. WeChat also has like somewhat of a pseudo dating platform. So as I go on and on and on and on about WeChat, the point that I'm making is that all of your basic needs, they can be met through this single app, right? Without entering into real space, but within this virtual platform, you can ostensibly live your life, right? And so in many ways, it's something that you cannot live without. So the works that are being made by this new generation, they're often characterized by these kind of maximalist aesthetics that combine materiality of post-internet art, as you see on the screen, with fashion design, with club culture. And so in many ways, their work, it kind of transcends the web and it moves into these new territories that include virtual and augmented reality, gaming, and of course, electronic music. So one of these artists, one of these younger artists, Lu Yang, born in 1984, in many ways she's taking cues from Cao Fei, blending the real and the virtual. However, unlike Cao Fei, who in many ways she's using virtual space as a way to inform her ongoing engagement with real space, Lu Yang is never really looking back, whereas she's abandoning real space and entering into virtual space. And so what I mean when I say that is this work, Delusional Mandala, which was a work created in 2013, it begins with her using this this sort of this body scan to transform herself into this virtual avatar, you know, sort of like a China Tracy R&B City avatar. But then over the course of the video, this avatar, she transforms herself into this god-like figure, and, you know, has this amazing virtual dance party, and then lives her life or the god lives their life out upon achieving enlightenment, and then perishes. And so the image on the right is the enlightened being's funeral carriage. So in many ways, these younger artists, they're kind of eschewing this issue of Chineseness, which was debated by previous generations, you know, artists like Xu Bing and Wong Gong Lin and others. And so artists like Lu Yang, they really seek to distribute their works through international connections and collaborations, and often would prefer that they were not referred to as Chinese artists, rather as international artists or just artists, period. So in many ways, a lot of these younger artists, they're kind of moving away from this nostalgia that is embraced by Cao Fei, and much more interested in this kind of reflexive commentary on the internet, along with this idea of what it means to exist as a post-human. So another work by the artist Miao Ying, this is part of the artist's gift project that she engaged in a few years ago. And so the artist herself, she self-describes herself as residing within virtual space. So if you ask her, you know, can I have a studio visit? She will tell you that her studio exists on the internet, on the Chinese internet, or what she refers to as the Chinternet. And so the work here is, in some ways, this cheeky response to internet censorship, or the makeup of the Chinese internet. And so the text in English, "Please cannot search your 30-degree smile," is based on this narrative that the artist created, where there are two lovers, and one of the lovers, she is in China, and the other is abroad somewhere. And so again, sort of drawing from this, you know, this idea of like this classical Chinese drama between lovers, the female, the protagonist, she attempts to access her boyfriend's Instagram page, but as Instagram is blocked in China, she cannot reach it. And so all she can do is use Baidu. And so Baidu is a search engine that's analogous to Google, and Baidu, the English translation is more or less 100 degrees. So she could not use Baidu to access, you know, her boyfriend's lovely smile from his Instagram page. And so this is sort of this kind of joke, this kind of play on language, is something, you know, not specific only to this generation, but it's really a part of cultural aesthetics that go back far, far further into the past. So Miao Ying and other members of the generation of this generation of Chinese artists, so they, I argue that they're working at this turning point in the internet industry, as the web, it's in some ways, it kind of disappears beyond app interfaces. They're foregrounding new trends and phenomena that will become even more relevant in the next decade, in years to come. And so the works of these artists, they represent the newest and the most innovative experimental projects happening anywhere. And so this is really the culmination of contemporary Chinese art activities whose history only spans 40 years. So we had quite the task this evening to try to jam pack such a long period, but also in many ways such a brief period of work, but nonetheless very rich work into such a short period of time. And so I will conclude by just noting that these artists, they explore identity as something that's fluid and itinerant within, young artists that have emerged in the past few years. They're more interested in this kind of global connectivity rather than something that's relatively domestic or diasporic, which were issues that artists were more interested in the 1990s. And so in this way, this new generation of artists, I find them so exciting because they're challenging, they're contradicting, and they're remembering in new ways, amidst this time, this period where progress is constantly accelerating the urge to forget. So once again, thank you so much to Christian and Julia for the invitation. And if there are any additional questions, I would be happy to answer. Sorry.
Well, we have a few, Ellen. So the first one is, when did art galleries and auction houses in China come into being and evolve?
Sure. So this phenomenon definitely happened within mainland China in the early 90s. And then, of course, with the advent of art districts like 798, lots of galleries just exploded. International galleries such as Pace were in Beijing for many years, sadly. They left last year. But.
Yeah. Okay, and the second question is, why were artists in the 90s interested in manipulating material and objects in unconventional ways?
That's a really...
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry.
The second part is, were they interacting with other contemporary movements in the art world?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think, as was the case for a lot of, quote unquote, apartment artists, simply because at that time they didn't have an incredible amount of access to materials, especially during that, immediate post 1989 period. And so they were much more interested conceptually as well in finding materials, objects from around the home. There's this concept that was included in the reading, this concept of maximalism, right. Which was this approach to art making that a lot of artists in the 1990s that they really adopted, which incorporates this kind of meditative, in some ways, this kind of religious approach to art making, where the purpose is not, the final product, but more the process and what comes through as a part of the process.
Right. It's a very methodical approach to art.
Right.
Okay, our next question is, what is the attitude of the Chinese government toward art and artistic political statements? Has it shifted within the past year? Is there a fear of crackdown?
So I think what I hoped to demonstrate throughout the presentation is that over the past 40 years, Chinese society goes through this period of ebb and flow, right? So, with the Cultural Revolution, that's this period of extreme control. The immediate period following the Cultural Revolution, the stars, they were protesting in the street, right? During the 80s, the 85 movement, artists were working all over, and then, 89 happens, and then, there's this crackdown. So I see, this kind of this ebb and flow as really characteristic of contemporary art in China. It really goes hand in hand. And I mean, I think that artists in China, there's a long history of artists in China making work. I mean, even if we look at ink painting, during China's dynastic period, there are examples of artists working within the system, but saying what they need to say. And so I see contemporary artists as, not necessarily limited in a direct way, where nobody's saying you can't make what you want to make. It's just sort of how one says what they want to say and in what form and who they want to say it to, to whom is it for?
Right. So not so much what you say, it's how you say it, how you frame it. The framing is crucial. And our final question is, what is the history of contemporary Chinese art exhibitions outside of China?
Oh, that's a great question. So there are several important exhibitions that took place in the 90s, actually. And again, I feel like I'm continuously plugging my PhD advisor, but
it happens.
But within the development of contemporary art, he is a leading figure.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah. Thank you for the backup.
Credit is due.
And so after in the early 90s, he traveled to the United States, where he stayed for the better part of going back and forth. He's spent time, within China and the US. And so in the 90s, he worked on a series of very, very important exhibitions. The Wall comes to mind, a super important exhibition in the 90s. Also Wu Hong, who's at the University of Chicago, has curated several important exhibitions of contemporary Chinese art. And then Hou Hanru, who left China after '89 and has done a lot of curatorial work in Europe.
Okay, excellent. Ellen, can't thank you enough. This was such an illuminating presentation, and you answered all these questions, and really, I feel, broadened all of our understanding of art from the Cultural Revolution till today. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to everyone for attending. I really appreciate your time and your questions. They're wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. And actually, I have nothing more to add to this. So we should have our next lecture in about 2 weeks. We'll send out invitations to you along with everybody else in our newsletters. Thank you so much for coming and attending this lecture tonight. Really a pleasure to spend our time with you, and we hope you enjoyed it. Take care. Bye-bye.